Welcome to the latest edition of the Mind Gut Conversation podcast, where I talk with thought leaders about various topics related to the One Health concept, including gut health, diet, wellness, and the role of the brain-gut microbiome system in health and disease. Today, I have the great pleasure to talk to Arielle Lorre, author of the Blonde Files, who posts contents related to food, fitness, wellness, fashion, and beauty. Arielle became an Instagram influencer in 2017 and has 250,000 followers. I recently was invited on Arielle's show and realized during our podcast that she has an amazing story of personal healing, resilience, and restoration of balance within the mind-gut connection to tell. I'm delighted that Arielle was willing to share this story on my podcast. So it's a real pleasure to have as my guest Arielle Lorre today. We did a podcast. She did a podcast with me a few weeks ago, and I greatly enjoyed talking to her. And some points of the conversation I found particularly interesting as a gastroenterologist and as a physician, and wanted to continue this conversation with you. So, I mean, first of all, how did you get into the wellness space? Was that based on, I mean, it's such a crowded space now that it's kind of challenging to even try to do something like that. But how did you get into it, and what was your main motivation?
I kind of fell into it accidentally. So 7.5 years ago, I got sober. I had a near fatal drug and alcohol addiction, and I'm very open about all of that. But whenever I tell my story and how I got into this line of work and how I became interested in wellness, that was really the starting point, because prior to that, I was a daily blackout drinker. I was a human dumpster, putting whatever drugs I could find inside my system. And I was really lucky that it didn't kill me. Not to be dramatic, but that was, by the end I was in the hospital. I was having seizures all the time. I was kind of in late stage alcoholism at the age of 28. So I ended up getting sober. And when I got sober, I was pursuing a career in behavioral health. I was really passionate about recovery and addiction and family recovery, and alcoholism and addiction being kind of a family disease. And so I was pursuing that. And at the same time, I was trying to get quote unquote healthy myself. So I felt like I had gone to treatment. I had done so much work emotionally. I was in treatment for almost a year, and I had worked through all of this stuff, and I found myself at a point where I was about a year sober, and I just felt like I didn't really know my body, and I had done so much damage to it over the years. So I had all kinds of symptoms going on, and I was trying to navigate all of that. But at the time, I really felt like my concept of what it meant to be healthy was really just kind of an aesthetic thing. I really just wanted to get like abs and get the body. And so I started doing a workout program online, and it was encouraged to have a social media account to meet other women that were doing that. And that was how I started my Instagram. And it really just kind of became a diary, kind of a journal of my pursuit of wellness, whether that's physical wellness, emotional wellness, spiritual wellness, and just this journey that I've been on. And it kind of took off from there.
That's an amazing story. I mean, we hadn't talked about this before, so, certainly creates a lot of motivation to do something special and to really get into that space from a very unique, personal history, I would say. So in your own experience, you felt that all these dimensions of wellness are really closely interconnected. It's not just, as I said, you started with, working on your abs, but then you soon realized this is not just physical, this is much bigger. So, one term that I've kind of coined for that, or adopted for this concept, is this One Health concept, that, you can't really fix one thing. Like we're not a machine where you fix one part or replace the engine. You have to sort of really work on the entire organism. And which one of these approaches would you think were most important for you?
Well, early on in my journey, I kind of was trying to just fix kind of piecemeal. So, I was trying to get the body, and I really didn't know anything about nutrition at that point. I didn't know anything about other factors like stress and sleep and these things that we are exposed to daily. And so I really was just approaching wellness from kind of a nutrition and a workout angle, I guess. I've talked about this, I think, on our episode. I really wanted food to be the cause and the cure for all of the things that I was experiencing. But so I started doing this workout program, which was a lot of really high intensity exercise. And, I thought, okay, I'm going to do like the no carb thing, like 0 carbs. And that, of course, had kind of a compensatory, or stimulated a compensatory response where then I eat everything and I'm binge eating at night. And then I tried doing the low fat, and then, all these different trends. And what was happening at that same time was I was experiencing extreme bloating, really terrible bloating, debilitating. I started having some GI issues, and it really wasn't until, and we'll get into all of this, until a couple years of trying to find not a cure, but some kind of solution that was effective for that I realized there's so many other components when it comes to wellness. And of course, like in my recovery, spirituality became a big part of that. And I'm a proponent of mental health and therapy, so there were other elements, but I really compartmentalized them for a long time, and I didn't realize how everything really works in concert together until maybe like 2-3 years ago.
And was this all self-exploratory, or did you find people that would really help you, guiding you in this? I mean, there's obviously a lot of health coaches nowadays. Didn't really exist when I, went to medical school, or like when I saw my first patients at UCLA. We didn't have a health coach. Now we do. But was there a particular role for somebody that helped you to put this all together and link it for you?
There have been a few along the way. So there was my gastroenterologist initially, and then there was a nutritionist who really helped me kind of look into more root cause stuff versus just the symptoms, the acute symptoms that I was having, and management of that. But through all of that, I really started to learn about myself. I started to learn about my body, and I realized, like I said before, how much of the lifestyle that I was leading and lifestyle factors contributed to the issues that I was having. And I always say that I'm kind of a rock bottom person, whether it was with my addiction. I have to hit rock bottom to be willing to make any kind of changes. And the same thing happened with my physical issues. I have to hit rock bottom before I'm willing to try something. I want to eat my dinner in front of the TV, looking at my phone, and then, do all these things. And I have to get to the point where I'm like, okay, this is really, I've tried all the other things. This is what's, contributing to these symptoms that I'm having. And so I have to have a little discipline and make a change. So there were people that kind of guided me in certain directions, but there hasn't been just one person throughout the whole time. And I will say, like, probably the majority of it was a lot of trial and error. And there are a lot of coaches now, there's a lot of practitioners, but I think it's difficult, especially with how big the wellness industry is. And particularly on social media, you never know somebody's experience or credentials really. And, there can be really good marketers who really don't know anything about what they're treating and what they're dealing with. So it's kind of a precarious place to be at the moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can see this from personal experience with my patients. So many of them have tried various things, like a series of different diets, from the extreme to, from total elimination diets to the latest in this space, the low FODMAP diet. And most of these patients that have just focused on one thing, like just on the diet or just on their bloating symptoms, which, as you know, is one of the most common gastrointestinal symptoms that, I mean, certainly like in my practice, that I see a lot of patients with that issue. And it is interesting to me, that very few people have actually then made this extension of their journey. They just go from one doctor to the other, and get all the pills for different pills for IBS. And certainly these kind of symptoms that are um, centered around a whole universe of influences that most physicians don't talk about with their patients because there's not even time to do it. But if you do take the time, you realize, and I speak really from a biased standpoint because the patients I see in my practice are self-selected. So in the past, it was always, there were referral as difficult patients that from other gastroenterologists that have unmanageable symptoms, or the last few years, it's been patients that have come across my first book, The Mind-Gut Connection, and said, this is exactly the person's so-and-so in your book is exactly what, that's who I am. And so I've seen this, and also the seduction of certain books that focus on one diet. I mean, I'm sure you've also gone through the phase of the gluten-free diet that most of my patients have gone through. Felt somewhat better, but then couldn't stick with it because it was just not practical. So it's interesting for me to hear this from you, how you've gone through this successfully, and ended up to actually making, like almost making a career out of your own suffering. I mean, this is quite remarkable. From your experience, I mean, did you run into a lot of people, friends, that were having similar types of symptoms, or were you pretty much on your own that kind of tried to understand this?
It was interesting because when I first started going through the issues that I was having, and it really kind of started overnight, the way that I remember it, it was very jarring to me because the symptoms were so severe and so unlike anything that I had ever experienced. And I was so ashamed about it. I think like digestive issues, just nobody wants to talk about it, especially to a bunch of strangers on the internet, like I was doing, or to people close to you. I mean, it can be a really kind of isolating thing in that way because I think you feel like you're alone and it's gross, or you don't want to talk about it. And I did talk to my family about it, and they had never experienced anything like what I was experiencing. And then I started sharing about it online a little bit, and I was shocked because it seemed like everybody and their mother and sister and aunt and brother, everybody was experiencing to some degree some kind of digestive issue. I think bloating especially is the most common one, like you were saying. And so, I just I felt like at the time, this was maybe 5 years ago, nobody was really talking about it. And I learned through my recovery that it's so important to connect with people through the struggles. And so if I could be that person that somebody else felt like maybe they weren't as alone, I wanted to do that. And I did try everything like you were talking about. And I did the gluten-free and the dairy-free and the refined sugar-free. I still avoid certain things because I know what triggers me at this point for the most part. But I was on a very restrictive diet for a little while. And then I realized when that wasn't serving me anymore. And so I have kind of gone through all the phases, and there are times that I look back on what I was sharing and I kind of cringe because I didn't know at the time. And I always like to kind of put a disclaimer up that like, I am not a professional. This is just my anecdotal experience. And, everybody should really find somebody qualified who can help them kind of navigate their own stuff and also really get to know your body.
I mean, the one thing, as a gastroenterologist who's seen throughout my career, thousands of patients with, what used to be called these functional gastrointestinal disorders are now called disorders of altered brain-gut interactions. I'm glad this term finally is being accepted universally. I mean, there's some really intriguing connections between, substance abuse and food addiction. Very similar mechanisms within the brain, similar neurotransmitters. So we actually have a research program going on this colleague of mine, Annie Gupta, who's studying this, and it's remarkable when you get into this, how closely these systems are connected. And then some examples, when obese people go through bariatric surgery, for example, to decrease their voracious appetite, they move into the field of drug addiction. You know, the addiction doesn't go from the brain by cutting your stomach into half, but it shifts just to another target. And then the other part is also really interesting because, you know, you were talking about this craving. So we've done a lot of studies on this system in the brain, this stress response system. So there's one molecule called corticotropin releasing factor that is released. It's kind of the main switch in your brain to change to a stress response, and then triggers downstream a cascade of other effects. And some of the highest levels of this corticotropin releasing factor are produced when somebody goes through a withdrawal. So, you know, a withdrawal or not having access to the drugs creates a tremendous amount of stress. And we know that the stress system also plays a big role in these GI symptoms. So there's clearly a connection between all the things that you have experienced, you know. So we know this now scientifically. It's not by coincidence that you've gone through these different stages and experiences.
To your point, I have these cookies that are gluten-free. They're vegan, gluten-free, refined, sugar-free, but they're still the best thing I've ever tasted. And when I have one of these cookies, the same thing that happens to me when I used to drink or use drugs happens, where all of my defenses go out the window. And even if I'm not hungry, I am like, my reward system has been hijacked. You know, I can feel it, where it's like the saying, one is too many, 1,000 is never enough. That happens to me with the cookies. So I think I do have kind of the same wiring. And that was something that, you know, again, I hit rock bottom with like the binge eating and the food addiction early on, when I kind of replaced one thing with another. But yeah, another thing that I did consider was, of course, like the substances that I was using, and also trauma. I don't know if that's something that you study. I'm sure it is, with the brain gut connection, but I had some big T traumas, like a little over 10 years ago. And when I started dealing with that in therapy, my therapist would do brain spotting with me, and she would ask me, okay, where do you feel activated? And it was always in my gut. So
yeah, and this connection between, you know, I mean, so the brain gut axis in terms of the stress response is one of the main systems that get engaged. You know, so we've studied this with other collaborators at UCLA. Again, with this hormone, if you this chemical switch, if you inject this into the brain of a rat or a mouse, you trigger all the GI issues, you know. So, and if you block this molecule, then you can stress the mouse and there's no GI symptoms. So there's clearly a very close connection, you know, probably of all the organs. I mean, the heart, yeah, your blood pressure goes up with stress and your heart rate goes up. But the gut really reacts the most intense way. And because there's so many systems in the gut, like the immune system and the endocrine system and you know, the nervous system in your gut, the little brain, they're all affected. Like when these signals come down from the brain during withdrawal or during craving, all this is being stimulated, you know. So it's, I mean, I have to congratulate you that you were able to overcome this. And also what you say about this, you know, the food that doesn't even have the sugar molecule, the actual offending molecule. Once you form these memories of these of these triggers, you don't need the actual trigger. You know, it's the context. As you know, I mean, I'm probably just telling you something that you've learned yourself and experienced. But yeah, you almost are an illustration of what we write in our review articles about the stress response and the brain-gut communication. And so the kind of, just a practical question. So you obviously have to continue to work on this. I imagine this is not something that if you said, I forget everything that I learned over the years, you might even fall back to a pattern, you know, that you were like 10, 20 years ago. So what kind of things are you doing now on a regular basis? And I assume it's the regular basis that maintain this optimal state of wellness for you.
So I kind of take cues from my recovery from drugs and alcohol. I'm active in my recovery, and I learned that I essentially have a daily reprieve. So what I did yesterday doesn't really apply to me today, and I have to do these things on a continual basis. So, with the gut issues, I really was hoping that I could take this pill. I got a colonoscopy, they found something, I went on steroids, and I was hoping that that would be it, and that was the cure, and I could move on with my life. But it has not been a linear progression. Um, and I have learned, so much about myself and my body and everything in the process. And so if anything, it's been a little bit of a blessing. That might sound kind of strange, but I've learned so much about how to better take care of myself and what wellness really looks like for me. And, for me, that's a lot of meditation. That became a huge part of my life. And I feel like people sometimes check out at meditation, but I was dealing with stress. I was dealing with gut issues. I was dealing with just feeling kind of activated a lot of the time. I don't know if that was from the trauma work that I was doing, just the stressors of day-to-day life. It was impeding on my sleep. And when I started meditating, it almost alleviated like all of that pretty quickly too. It had a really profound effect on me. So that has been really big. And that kind of taught me how to slow down in other areas of my life and be mindful. I'm a person who works on my phone. So I can wake up, and if I'm not paying attention, I'll get on my phone at 6:30 and I'm in my email, and then I'm pissed off at this person, and then I have to do this, and I'm looking at my calendar and I'm all over the place, and then go. And then, I'm in bed at like 11 and I have not been present for 1 second of the day. And when I do that, I know from experience that I'm in that kind of like fight or flight stage, and like my digestion is offline, my hormones are probably all over the place. And I just can't live like that. And I did, and I hit rock bottom. And so, I'm really mindful. I think the most important thing for me these days is my morning routine. So I don't get on my phone when I wake up. I get 8 hours of sleep, and then when I wake up, I go and I do my meditation, I do some readings, I do my kind of spiritual work. I meditate for 20 minutes in silence. I do transcendental meditation. I journal. I do a few things. It's not like, it takes maybe 30, 35 minutes. And that really sets the tone for my day and reminds me to kind of be present and be slow where I can and be mindful. So that's really big. Eating my meals without distractions has been really big, which is a daily struggle, but I'm getting better. I try to even eat outside if I can with the natural sunlight, and that just really helps me. And then kind of sandwiching my day with a little bit of a nighttime routine too. So where I'm off the phone, I'm taking a bubble bath, I'm getting in bed early, reading a book to kind of slow down. And those kind of bookends really help. They just help me to stay balanced throughout the day. So
yeah, I mean, it's really wonderful to listen to you. So mindfulness clearly is something that it's not a coincidence that so many people in the West now are embedding these contemplative techniques into their lives, because the stress level, even without your history, when you look at this, and I sort of emphasize this in my new book as well. So we're really exposed to two kinds of stressors that evolution did not design us for. One is the chronic persistent stress that we create with these devices, like being linked to the internet and being flooded constantly with generally negative information and stuff that makes you worry. And so our stress systems are designed to produce a rapid, acute response that has saved humans survival many times when they were attacked by a wild animal or in a war situation. But that's not really, that's not really helpful today in today's world, where we have few of these acute stresses, life-threatening stresses, but a lot of the chronic persistent stress that goes 24/7, for a lot of people. If you could measure the level of your stress hormones over a week's period, day and night, you will see it's higher than it was like 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And the other thing is this dietary stress, which is, it's not perceived by our brain, but it's perceived by our complex gut system and its counterpart, the immune system. So the bad food that we put in and the changes then in the microbes is perceived by the immune system as a chronic stress. The immune system, again, is designed to produce a rapid response to counteract an infection, but it's not designed to respond chronically to like an unhealthy diet. So our systems are challenged by the chronic stress that comes from the environment and the chronic stress that comes from our diet. So I think and that whole situation has obviously been aggravated by the pandemic. I mean, there's a whole added stress level to it, and it's not a coincidence that deaths and morbidity from substance abuse has gone up through the roof, and depression, anxiety, and so again, I mean, the way that you describe it is, so I'm not just give you the scientific, side to it, but your experiential side is really more important for most people. I mean, you don't know, they have to know exactly the mechanisms why it happens, but you have to experience that these situations trigger it, and that it's self-help. It's not something. Yeah, a doctor can give you a pill, he can give you a Xanax pill, and it will calm things down, but it's not a solution. It's just
until it doesn't too. I mean, oftentimes, because that was one of the things that I took, Xanax, because I always thought that I was just an anxious person and that was just my destiny. And with that pill and other treatments, management of symptoms, it only works until it doesn't, and it stops working at a certain time, and you either need more or you need to switch to something else. And that's not to say, obviously I'm not a physician, but that's not to say they don't have a time and place. They do, for a lot of people. But I really learned about like getting to the root of my issues, and I did that through, like I said, like hitting rock bottom.
Do you have a lot of interactions with other people? I mean, you have a huge following on Instagram. Do you exchange your experiences with a lot of people, either on social media or or in other settings?
Yeah, I feel like my purpose, at least right now, is to share what I've gone through and what I've learned, and people can take from that, and hopefully it inspires them to do the investigative work on their own lives and try different things. I don't claim to have the answers, and like I said earlier, I'm kind of grateful for the struggles and the experience that I've gone through, because ultimately it's taught me a lot. And are there days where I'm like, I wish that I could eat XYZ and do this and not have a response and not be so sensitive? Sure. But at the same time, I really do have gratitude for everything that I've learned. And so, yeah, I share on my podcast, I share on my Instagram, I have a newsletter that I share on, but those are my main forms of communication on social media. And people connect to the struggles and the real parts of life, not just like the pretty facade.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, certainly the social media help to spread, if you want to reach a lot of people. I mean, it's a satisfying experience that you can, I mean, I've always felt this. So at some point, about 15 years ago, we started this, what we called an IBS class at UCLA, where we have a group of people, and it was sort of a group cognitive behavioral therapy session. And that was very satisfactory. But then I realized this was just before social media really took off. And you would reach a group of 10 people, and it took 8 weeks to do that, and was very inefficient. Today, it's a much better way of spreading the word to a lot of people along, and with online classes or master classes, you reach with thousands of people that can really do that. So you also mentioned trauma along the way. So Was this something that you experienced early on in life, or was this something that came later, or both?
It came later. So I've actually done the adverse childhood survey, and I have like 0 out of, I can't remember how many there are. I was kind of an anomaly because nobody in my family on either side has any issues with addiction or anything like that. So I started that trend. I think I was just, highly sensitive and a little bit maladjusted to life. But I did have a big T trauma in my mid 20s where I found my friend murdered. And that was a real turning point for me and for my drinking and using, because it kind of took on a survival thing. I did not have any coping mechanisms, nor do most people, I don't think, to deal with that kind of thing. And at that time, I was already pretty well into my addiction anyway. So that was my only coping mechanism. And that was something that I just, I shut down. And when I finally got sober, I actually had to go and testify and everything. And I felt like after that, I had some closure on it. And then a couple years later, I started having trauma symptoms, where it would be hard for me to walk into a room. I was having panic attacks all the time. Some physiological symptoms, it was kind of aligned with when my gut issues started. And that was, I really believe that trauma somehow lives in your body. And again, I would love to hear the science behind this. I like sharing my experience and then having you share the mechanisms. I think it's fascinating. I didn't believe it at first. And then, like I said, when I started doing brain spotting with my therapist to kind of release that trauma and relive it, but in a way that's like essentially squeezing the lemon. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but you're kind of reliving it in a controlled setting until the agitation that you experience when you think of it is reduced each time. And
yeah, it's like a desensitization, so that's yeah, I mean, I always compare this to putting like you can't erase the memory, but you can develop this software patch, that's over your amygdala. So you no longer, that automatic trigger will no longer happen. I mean, it seems to me like you had a PTSD like experience there, and that, I mean, a lot of people that have been exposed to trauma in combat situations and didn't have the right therapy, for a long time, were not able to sort of cope with it, and ended up with in alcoholism. I mean, like the big portion of the VA, the Veterans Administration population, has had this problem, like the Vietnam era veterans. It was not recognized as a real thing, this PTSD, and was not treated. And yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of the societal problems that happened after that war with, homelessness and drug addiction was a consequence of that trauma. Yeah. It is interesting that you say you didn't have the early life trauma, because that's something we've also studied in have a great interest in that, where you sort of influence the development of your stress system within the brain. Quite a common phenomenon, in many patients with irritable bowel syndrome and anxiety disorders. Yeah, we just published a recent study that it's hard to believe that this was even reflected in the composition of the gut microbes and the chemicals they produce. So somehow that programming and that chronic stress influence on the gut also affects the microbes, which could then ultimately also play a role in the bloating type symptoms, because it's so. Yeah, as you said, it is fascinating to me to talk to you, because you come up with the clinical real life situation, and it just matches so perfectly, with the kinds of research that our group has done over the last decades. Really,
I'm textbook.
Yeah, you're a textbook. Yeah, and yeah, if I still did real live lectures, you'd be a good person to be part of a lecture.
I love to.
It's the illustration of the symptoms. So since we only have a few minutes now left with this, what advice would you give to people that that are in a similar, I mean, there's a lot of people still stuck in that situation that you were like 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Um, what advice would you give them in terms
People
of
who
getting,
are,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, just, what advice to get out of this whole, would you give them?
In terms of like addiction and alcoholism or with the
Yeah.
health issues? Gosh, that's hard. You would think that I would have like an answer right away. People ask me if there's anything that anybody could have said that would have changed the course of my life. And I feel like I really just had to go through it. And I was done when I was done. But, I think it's important for people to know that they can recover and that it doesn't have to be perfect and it doesn't have to be linear, and you're going to feel all the feelings, and life is going to happen on life's terms, and but that people can do it. And I could not stop drinking for 2 consecutive days for 10 years.
Right.
And here I am 7.5 years later, and if I can do it, anybody can do it. And same thing with the health issues, just trial and error, keep trying different things. Look at the whole picture, like you were saying in the beginning, like whole health. It's not just one thing at a time. It's so interconnected. And I know how frustrating it can be to be experiencing those things and feel like there's no way out. But there is.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this was really, it was both very informative for me to listen to this, and hopefully also for the listeners and viewers, or in similar situations. I think it's an extremely valuable lesson, and so.